The weapon that built England before the British Empire was not a machine of metal, but a system of human bodies, law, and time. For centuries, military power in Europe was a closed system, a privilege of birthright, expensive armor, and trained war horses. This closed system defined chivalry warfare and secured noble dominance. The armored knight on his charger represented an immense investment of wealth and training. A single knight was a walking fortress, a symbol of a social order that seemed permanent and divinely ordained. This is History and Society, where we explore how systems quietly shaped civilizations, long before people understood what was happening. Wales existed on the periphery of this feudal world, a land considered poor, rugged, and of little strategic importance. Its mountainous terrain did not support the large-scale cavalry operations that defined mainstream European warfare, forcing a different military evolution out of necessity. This peripheral status bred a unique martial tradition. Welsh fighters, lacking the resources for heavy armor and war horses, relied on long, powerful self-bows made of yew. They developed a proficiency that would soon disrupt the established conventions of medieval battlefields. In the late 11th century, Norman expansionist ambitions turned toward Wales. Norman armies, confident in their cavalry-centric tactics, invaded the rugged Welsh territories. They expected a swift victory over what they perceived as a primitive and disorganized foe, a simple matter of conquest. The encounter produced a strategic shock. Norman knights, encased in mail and steel, found themselves vulnerable to Welsh archers. The longbow's heavy arrows could pierce armor at a distance, felling knights and their mounts cheaply. This demonstrated a critical weakness in the feudal military model. England's rulers took notice of this disturbing new reality. They observed not just a superior weapon, but a complete system of recruitment, training, and deployment. The English crown realized that copying the bow alone was insufficient. The entire Welsh approach to archery needed adaptation. King Edward I initiated this strategic shift by integrating Welsh archers into his armies for campaigns in Scotland and Wales. He recognized that their effectiveness came from coordinated volleys, not individual marksmanship. This was a departure from the heroic individual combat of knighthood. A new legal framework emerged to support this military transformation. The Assize of Arms of 1252 was updated, and later statutes made archery practice mandatory for the English peasantry. Sundays, once reserved for leisure and church, were repurposed for military training by the state. This legislation created a vast, semi-trained reserve of potential archers across the kingdom. The English crown, through sheriffs and local officials, could now conscript thousands of men already familiar with the weapon. The state was actively cultivating a specific military skill within its populace. Mastering the longbow was not a matter of weeks or months. It required a lifetime of dedication. The immense draw weight of the warbow demanded constant practice from a young age to develop the necessary strength and technique. It was a generational investment. This immense physical stress literally reshaped the bodies of English archers. Skeletal remains from the period, such as those of the Mary Rose archers, show enlarged left arms, curved spines, and developed shoulder bones. The state's military needs were imprinted directly onto human anatomy. The economic logic was undeniable. A yeoman archer, equipped with a bow and arrows, was vastly cheaper to field than a fully armored knight. Yet, in large numbers, these low-cost soldiers could deliver a volume of fire that nullified the high-cost elite cavalry. This new reality began to erode the certainty of the chivalric ideal. A nobleman's expensive armor no longer guaranteed his survival on the battlefield. His monopoly on effective violence was being systematically dismantled by a state-organized system of peasant-based firepower. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 served as the first major proof of this concept on the European stage. An English army, heavily outnumbered, chose its ground carefully. The French nobility, confident in its cavalry, charged uphill into a prepared defensive position. The result was a catastrophic defeat for the French. King Philip VI watched as wave after wave of his elite knights were cut down by disciplined volleys of English arrows. The English system of terrain, discipline, and massed archery had triumphed over traditional chivalric force. The pattern repeated itself a decade later. At the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the French attempted to counter the English archery threat by having their knights dismount and advance on foot. The tactical adaptation acknowledged the bow's power, but was ultimately insufficient. Under the command of Edward the Black Prince, the English army again used defensive positioning and concentrated arrow fire to break the French assault. The capture of the French king, John II, proved that Crécy was not a fluke, but the result of a repeatable system. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 became the most famous demonstration of the longbow's dominance. A small, exhausted English army was cornered by a vast French force. The muddy terrain, a result of recent heavy rains, became a critical factor in the battle. The French knights, bogged down in the mud and channeled into a narrow front, became easy targets for King Henry V's archers. The ensuing slaughter destroyed a significant portion of the French nobility and cemented the longbow's fearsome reputation throughout Europe. This form of warfare was a departure from the romanticized ideal of chivalric combat. Longbow volleys were impersonal, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient. Death came from a distance, delivered by an anonymous peasant, stripping battle of its perceived honor and individual glory. This new military reality had profound political consequences. The logistical demands of raising, equipping, and supplying large armies of archers required a level of organization that only a centralized state could provide. The power of the English monarchy grew accordingly. Consequently, the military independence of the feudal nobility declined. Private armies, centered on a few dozen knights, were no longer the decisive element in warfare. A monarch who could command thousands of archers held the ultimate military authority, shifting power toward the crown. Other states, particularly France, attempted to replicate England's success. They had access to yew for bows, and certainly had the manpower. However, they lacked the crucial social and political components: the legal framework, the state-enforced training, and the long-term institutional patience. The French monarchy was unwilling and unable to arm its peasantry on such a scale, fearing it would empower rebellion. The French nobility also resisted a system that devalued their traditional role. As a result, their archery corps remained a secondary and less effective force. The English longbow system was not without its weaknesses. Its primary limitation was its extreme dependence on highly skilled, physically conditioned individuals. The decades-long training pipeline made it difficult to replace losses quickly, a vulnerability that would eventually be exploited. The rise of firearms in the 15th and 16th centuries presented a new military technology that was easier to scale. A soldier could be trained to use an arquebus or musket in a fraction of the time it took to train a master bowman. England's transition away from the longbow was relatively smooth. The state did not collapse. It adapted. The core principles of mass recruitment, state-managed logistics, and disciplined formations learned during the longbow era were directly transferable to the new age of gunpowder warfare. The focus of military organization shifted from shaping human bodies to managing a bureaucratic system. The state apparatus built to supply arrows and bow staves was repurposed to manufacture gunpowder and firearms. The underlying structure of centralized military control remained intact. Military thinking evolved, but the fundamental logic discovered by the English crown persisted. The idea that a state could organize its common population into a decisive military force became a cornerstone of European state building. The weapon changed, but the system endured. This created the foundation for later British imperial power. The myth of the empire often begins with ships, trade, and cannons, but the institutional capacity for large-scale organization was forged centuries earlier in the fields of England with yew-bows and legal statutes. The ability of the later British Empire to project power across the globe was not born in the 18th century. It was the inheritor of a system of discipline, logistics, and training that predated firearms. The culture of mass military management was already deeply ingrained. The real discovery of the longbow era was not the weapon itself, but a principle of political technology. It proved that a state could harness the collective power of its ordinary people through law and organization, creating a force more powerful than any small, wealthy elite. The state that would later build the British Empire was first built by the longbow. The 100 Years' War was not just a conflict with France. It was a crucible that forged a new kind of centralized, bureaucratic English state capable of unprecedented military mobilization.